We continue now at the top of Daf Lamed Aleph Amid Beis in Meseches Bava Basra. This is Bava Basra Daf 31b. On the previous summit, the Gemara had a case where one person has witnesses that the land belonged to his ancestors and he had been there long enough to establish a chazakah. And the second person brings witnesses that contradict the first in terms of the chazakah. The second witnesses say that it was the second person that was there long enough to establish a chazakah. And so Rava said, since the two sets of witnesses contradict each other, you essentially have to throw out those witnesses entirely. However, if Nachman responds, it's true that they contradict one another in terms of the years of chazakah, but ba'avahasa miyaskachish, is there any contradiction in terms of the ancestors? And therefore we should rely on the witnesses in terms of that and give it to that individual who the witnesses said it belonged to his ancestors. As the Rashbam here says, b'da'avahasa miyaskachish, eidos shel avahasa, meaning the testimony in terms of the fact that it belonged to his ancestors, kayamhu, so that testimony is still good. V'hakol modin bo, everybody admits to that, so you can take that part of the testimony. And so the Gemara now says, Leimu Rava v'Rav Nachman beplugsa de Rav Huna v'Rav Chisda kamiflagi. Let us say that this machlokus between Rav and Rav Nachman, if we accept part of the testimony, when you have these two sets of witnesses that contradict one another, it's the same machlokus that we find between Rav Huna and Rav Chisda. Dietmar, because it was stated the following machlokus amuroim, beis kitei edem, you have two sets of witnesses, hamachishos zu ezu, that they contradict one another. Amar Rav Huna says, Zuba b'fnei atzmo me'ida, this first set can come on a different case and testify, we still accept them as good witnesses. V'zuba b'fnei atzmo me'ida, and the other one also can come in a different case and testify. You don't say that they're completely disqualified from being witnesses in the future. For Rav Chisda, Amar, but Rav Chisda says, Bahade sahadi shakri lamali, what do we need to deal with witnesses that are liars for? You know they're contradicting each other. Clearly, at least one of them has lied in this first case. You have a suffix on both sets, whether they can testify, and therefore we no longer accept these witnesses to testify in future cases. And so the Gemara says, Leimer Rav Nachman d'Amar Rav Huna. Let us say that Rav Nachman, he says like Rav Huna, because essentially Rav Huna is saying that they might not be believed in the case they contradict, but they're believed in other cases. And that's what Rav Nachman said also. Maybe they're not believed in terms of the Shnei Chazaka, but you can still accept the testimony in terms of the Avahasa, in terms of the fact that it belonged to his ancestors. V'Rava Rav Chisda will say that Rava follows Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda says we throw them out entirely. And also over here, Rava says we throw out the testimony entirely. And the Gemara says it's not necessarily parallel. Now, in terms of Rav Chisda, everybody would agree, because Rav Chisda is saying they can't testify even in future cases. So certainly in this situation where it's the same case, you wouldn't accept part of the testimony. So there is no machlokas. Rav Chisda would certainly say that you throw out the testimony entirely in our case. However, it could be that they argue even both if they both accepted the idea of Rav Huna, because again, Rav Huna said you can accept them in future cases. There still might be a machlokas amoraim in this very case. As the Gemara now explains, Rav Nachman Rav Huna, Rav Nachman would certainly follow Rav Huna, because Rav Huna says you can accept them in future cases. Rav Nachman says you can accept even part of the testimony in this case. But Rava would make a distinction, and he would say that he also agrees with Rav Huna. Adkan lo kama Rav Huna elo le'edas acheres. Rav Huna only allowed it in a different testimony. Avola oso edas lo, but for that exact same testimony, let's say a different part of it, he would not accept it. And so therefore you could say that within Rav Huna, Rava could say that Rav Huna would even agree with him. And the Gemara continues, in the end they accepted Rav Nachman's ruling that the property goes to the person who had the testimony that it belonged to his ancestors, but then the other party, Hadar Aisi Sahadi, Tahavasahi, the other party which initially had witnesses only that he had Shnei Chazaka, again that was the point that was contradicted by the witnesses, but then that person brought witnesses also that it belonged to his ancestors, and now you really did have a situation of contradictory witnesses. And so Amar Rav Nachman then said, Ano achtine, we took the land away, we gave it to that particular person at first, but now, Anon maskinale, now we can take it back, we can take back our initial ruling, and lezilusa devedina lo chayshin, and we're not concerned that this is going to be a disgrace to the court, that now the court went ahead and changed its ruling. That's not a concern of ours. New information came along, and therefore we are allowed to change our ruling. And the Gemara continues, Mesiv Rava v'Teimer Rabbi Zeira. Rava and some say Rabbi Zeira ask a question from the following brisa. The brisa says, Shnayim omrim meis. Let's say you have two witnesses that say a particular husband died, and therefore the woman, the wife, is allowed to remarry. Ushnayim omrim lo meis. Two witnesses say he didn't die, she's not allowed to remarry. Essentially contradictory witnesses on this issue. Similarly, Shnayim omrim nisgarsha. Two witnesses say the woman was divorced, she's allowed to remarry. Ushnayim omrim lo nisgarsha. Two witnesses say she was not divorced, she's not allowed to remarry. So the halach is harezu lo tinasi. In this case of contradictory witnesses, she should not be allowed to remarry. However, if she does remarry, lo teitze, we won't force her to leave that new marriage. In a situation where she already did it, she can stay married. Rabbi Menachem Rabbi Yossi says, teitze, no, we do force her. She does have to leave that marriage. But Rabbi Menachem Rabbi Yossi says, when do I say that we force her to divorce? That's bisman shabo edom v'achar kach nisas. That's if first the edom came, meaning we had the full set of contradictory witnesses, including the witnesses that say that she should not be getting remarried, and then she goes ahead and remarries, then we say she has to divorce. Avol nisas, but let's say she gets remarried, and the witnesses that have said she shouldn't, those ones contradicting the first witnesses, they have not arrived yet. So she got married already, and then Edom came, and the Edom have testified that it's problematic. Now you have a situation of contradictory witnesses, so now already it looks like it's going to be a zilusa de beidina, is what the Gemara is assuming he is saying. The idea being, again, that do we go back on our initial ruling that allowed it? So there, harezu lo teitze. There, Rabbi Nachum Rabbi Yossi says, we do not, she does not go out from that second marriage, we don't overturn it, because there we already essentially issued a ruling that she's allowed to remarry. She did that, and now later to overturn it seems to be Rabbi Menachem Rabbi Yossi is saying that would be a zilusa de beidina, would cause a contempt for the court, and therefore we do not overturn the ruling. And so that's the question that they brought against Rav Nachman, who just said that lezilusa de beidina lo chashin, and we're not concerned of the contempt of the court. So Amar Leis, Rav Nachman said, Anasavri lemebar uvda, I thought to rule in accordance with my original logic, but hashta dos visan at, now that you're asking me this question, va'osvan Rav Hamnuna Besuria, and Rav Hamnuna in Surya also asks a similar question, lo avdinan ba'uvda, so I'm not going to rule in accordance with what I initially thought. It does seem that we are concerned with zilusa de beidina. But then the Gemara says, Nafak avad uvda, he went out, Rav Nachman nevertheless went out, and actually did do a ruling in accordance with what he had initially thought, and said that it was not an issue, zilusa de beidina. And so man dechaza, the person who saw that he issued this ruling, savar te'usa biyadeh, thought that he was making a mistake. He just said that he was going to follow the ruling that we are concerned with zilusa de beidina, and now he's not concerned. But the Gemara says, V'lo, it's not true, it's not a mistake. Elamisham detalia ba'ashle ravrave. The reason why he ruled that way is because he depended on great authorities who seem to be saying that we're not concerned. And the Rashbam here says, detalia ba'ashle ravrave. Who are the Ashley ravrave? Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, Kulu Svirlu, they all hold the lo chashinan lezilusa de beidina, that we are not concerned with zilusa de beidina. Kedemefarish Rav Ashi b'maskana, as Rav Ashi will explain in the conclusion. And the Gemara continues, D'Tanan, as we learned in the Mishnah in Ksubis, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yehuda says, Ein malin lakun al pi echad, you can't rely on one witness in order to establish a person, that the person should be presumed to be a Kohen. Omer Rabbi Elazar says, Ein Mosai, when is this true? B'makom sheyesh oren, that's if there are people protesting that the person is not considered to be a Kohen. Aval b'makom she'ein oren, but if there's no one protesting, malin lakun al pi echad, then you can even use one witness in order to say that somebody is a Kohen. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, Mishum Rabbi Shimon ben Haskan, in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Haskan, malin lakuna al pi echad, you are allowed to say that someone is presumed to be a Kohen through one witness. And so the Gemara says, Rav Shimon ben Gamliel, Hainu Rabbi Elazar. It seems that Rav Shimon ben Gamliel and Rabbi Elazar, they're saying the same thing, because essentially they are both saying that you're malin lakuna al pi echad. Rabbi Elazar saying if there's orin you can't, but otherwise you could. And Rav Shimon ben Gamliel also seems to be saying in the name of Rav Shimon ben Haskan that you're allowed to be mal al pi echad. And the Gemara says, V'chitema ir chadika beinau. Now, if you're going to say that the difference is, what if you have protests, but the protest is just from one person, it's not from two people? And you'll say as follows, Rabbi Elazar savar ir chad. Rabbi Elazar says even if it's just one protest, one person protesting, that's considered to be a protest. And so Rabbi Elazar would say with one person protesting, you're not allowed to be malin lakun al pi echad. And Rav Shimon ben Gamliel says the opposite, you are allowed to be mala in that case. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Lamed Beis Amud Aleph.